Okay, let's get started. We've got 7 people signed up, so please try to keep it at 10 minutes. Before we do get started, I want to tell you all about an event that we have tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Steve Miller's going to be here to talk about his book, North Carolina Unionist. So join us if that's something that interests you.
Is he bringing his band?
So first up we have Matt Nelson.
Yay! Okay, for those of you who do not know what I do, I like taking song titles of artists I like and making one long narrative poem about it. And I wanted to read this last time, but most people didn't know how to work the sign-in sheet. But glad I have it right now. I was actually able to put a little bit more in before coming here. So I hope you enjoy this thing. If you know who the artist is, don't say it until the very end. And I also like to dedicate this to my classmates who are at a convention in Statesville. I may not be a religious man, but I'm a stone-cold believer in people creating miracles. The problem is that people hold on loosely to their dreams, letting the magic run away. While no one has their prayers answered the first time around, you can't give up, and it doesn't take much to get back on track if the mental storm is quieted to begin healing. You see, it's not wrong to want to help someone in need instead of a little guidance and a friend. Yet, many have to become a trooper with an attitude to break through the constant despair, while you just want to rock and roll to spread smiles across the slumbering wastelands. Just a little love blocks the darkness of the past, allowing a few moments of joy to peek out from the fog, instead showing that everyone needs a second chance to find their purpose. You see, I've found being a little more optimistic is like seeing chain lightning at night. The world lights up for a few moments with somebody like you watching the same display, wanting the midnight magic to keep going, to see the world without constant shadows, so they can get back to paradise without the need to close their eyes all the time. Now, life isn't going to be like 20th Century Fox and spruce up the hidden wonders, as people can do wondrous things if they turn any quick fix into a lasting resolution. The one thing I've seen tear people away from true happiness is if the squeeze of life getting tighter before love strikes away the invisible walls society puts up like a colossal cage. Even if someone tries to fly away from their prison or tell others how to do the same, someone will say, "I want you back where you belong," trapped within the sea of despair. Oops. I said, sorry. Hold on. Tablet. It said, going around and around like they don't even know which way leads towards the light. One thing that always helped me find solace is to play a simple song or two before bed to take me through the night so that the bitter morning isn't quite as daunting, if only for a while. I used to ask, what if I had been the one who had the power to make others smile without hurting? This being the last time I allowed myself to be controlled by others, or not feeling guilty from knowing my heart's on fire and wanting to share the warmth with those who kept in the cold. Like finding a lost treasure far too big for any one person to use up in one lifetime. So going against the night and share everything without anyone wanting to do the same, so that you don't get caught up in you not having the confidence to take that first step in ending isolation. I know that you come saying shelter me, but only if you can define what keeps you safe in this strange place we all call reality. And first you need to make some of it before setting out to find your saving grace with many more like you, also in need of compassion to avoid the cold. I've been called a fire starter from those leaving the dark rut and bringing others with them. To see the miracle man who discovered that there wasn't a shortcut to joy among the wasteland, when being changed by love is one of the greatest miracles life has to offer in any dark moment. Sure, there'll be those who say freedom leads to trouble. Yeah, a little chaos is good for the soul. I think those people were born against steel, turning them cold before knowing what love was. To avoid burning bridges meant to unite the hearts of many instead of dunking them in ice. Rebel to rebel, I know that what I'm saying sounds like I've gone pretty far on the insane side, yet I consider myself to be one of the wild-eyed southern boys wanting to have a good time, to shatter the silence of not being able to share my feelings instead about this world gone very mad. I'm sure you want to ask, what if I can't find my way back if I get too scared of change? Not sure about that. So what I can do is that if one detour, but what can I do if one detour brightens your smile without any tears? Can you resist the temptation to turn back from the path of salvation fades to blue? I can't answer these questions, as everyone is different. I can't jam on without you being sad. I said, you need to stop hiding from yourself. I said, so that the shine from your soul can come through, and not being afraid. I said, for the smallest signs of love to restore a little hope every day you remain. Sometimes you have to find an old memory and tear it up to feel the relief of one less burden. Well, saying I ought to let go more of my dark feelings to make room for happier ones. Luckily, these occasions don't occur once in a lifetime. It said, no matter the distance between them. It said, so if someone says you're one in a million, it means you're never truly alone in this dim rock. Even if the fire is gone from your old life, a new flame that will take its place, serving as a beacon for those in need, for removing the deja voodoo, keeping them from seeing the golden light. I guess I'm a fool for you. Once I found myself unable to move against society schemes and said, I see me in your eyes, so I know that you aren't beyond saving for even a second. If I had someone to tell me, just hang on a little longer, then I wouldn't have felt so hollow, for not seeing the world once to live in the light, and it serves as an undercover lover for all. In a way, the earth can be anyone's fantasy girl, he said, if they take a moment to calm down and listen, as she likes to talk with those wanting a fresh start and to see others do the same. Even a few soft words means you're not one of the lonely ones for much longer. He said, trying to help someone next to you this night could be like no other night, and in no time, the same old feeling of being cold, pushed aside, said, by the glow of the coming dawn, provided you hold back, and said, on the rough housing long enough to make a few new friends. Even the sound of your voice, being sincere, can chase away the bitterest of heart winters. This is the play in the rough game of life that quickly breeds tomorrow's champions. So if you feel strange from the melting inside, remember, nothing hurts like love returning to glory. Tell everyone that they don't have to feel alone if they haven't achieved much in life so far, and give them more than a reason to never give an inch to those wanting others to silently suffer while they ride on 4 wheels of luxury, so when they're the poorest in heart and mind. Never look back, and people will be turning to you like you have done to me this time. Said, remember, I just can't leave you alone on this road ahead. He said, as it's very long and littered with doubt. He said, but you'll never be lonely if you keep taking steps towards the horizon away from your biggest fears, so that your long-distance love affair with grief will end before you know, and without hearing the call away from, said, who you want to be, and are no longer afraid to let out for all to see. Trust me when I say you got the deal of a lifetime waiting for you once you cast off your gloom, so that your innocent eyes can finally see the world is full of bright colors mixed by love. I know you're scared, but having the right teacher can assure you anything is possible, despite many saying that prosperity is 1 in a million chance that can never be found. However, I say bring it on, as miracles shared with good people are always worth fighting for, provided those who are lost throw out the line to brave the sea of uncertainty leading to peace. Even though you can't say, take me back once things get too hard and hope slips away a bit. Happiness is like getting a new piece of clothing, and you don't want to get it dirty even once. Chaos is always a tour de force meant to be experienced with all the wrinkles it brings, and They say you can't keep a good man down when it feels so good and said to go up quickly. If all its fears, keep rocking into the night to feel the rush with others, so that you'll have one time for the old times, so that others can know there's a light, that the light is their friend. Anyone know who I chose?
Rolling Stones, Give Me Shelter.
No, that was 38 Special. Yeah. So I heard them a lot on the radio, and some of these things, you know, always kind of speak to you. But you know, just one of those things where I always wanted to do them, and now was the night to do that. So you're welcome.
All right, next up we have Benjamin Cutler.
Good evening. Yes, my name is Benjamin Cutler. I don't want to take too much of my 10 minutes talking about myself, but I will introduce myself for a moment. I wandered over here from Whittier tonight, and I am an English teacher at Swain County High School. I'm also a poet, and I am also the Net West rep for Swain County. So if you're looking for an additional open mic, we're going to have our first open mic on April 11th. So 2 weeks from yesterday. It's going to be at Nantahala Brewery. We're calling it Pints, Poems, and Prose. They have a great venue there, great stage. So it's going to be the same time, really kind of same format as this. So love to have all of you come over for that too on that Thursday. I got 2 poems for you tonight. The first one I'm going to read to you is going to be appearing in my debut collection of poetry. It's coming out from Main Street Rag in May. And it also just appeared in Pembroke Magazine, which arrived in the mail today, so I'm still feeling pretty pleased about it. This is to the turkey vulture pacing the field. The field has been cut for hay, though not yet baled, and you have noticed. Your wide-winged shadow a haunt on this sheet of midday gold, a revenant undeterred by light. I must say, now that you have landed, you look less impressive on your feet. Awkward as a potato sauntering through the straw. More turkey than vulture as you nose the earth. You must have found what you were looking for, because you have stopped. Some mouse, mole, or cottontail kit. They must have felt safe in their green cathedral, vaulted ceilings of seed-weighted grass, until they could not escape the tractor's indifferent thrash. These carrion do not feel you rip their skin, your bald head burrowing into bowel, or your beak breaking bone. You have waited, as you always do, for the stillness and breathless bloat. And in this, I think perhaps you are kinder than your feather-crowned kin, who kill and bleed their fear-choked prey in flight. But you, eater of the departed, you have finished your quiet meal where it rests, and have again taken flight, casting that same earthbound specter. Though now you seem less ominous, less mysterious, and not so different from the rest of us, with your belly full of dead things and your endless, hungry search. Thank you very much. The next poem I'd like to share is it's a newer one. I have 4 children, and they occasionally are featured in my poetry. But my oldest, who is just about to turn 15, he pointed out, to my great shame, that I have not written a poem about him. And so I made that a challenge for myself. And so this is one of my more recent poems. I've managed to write a poem about my angsty teenage son. And this is called To My Eldest at the Age of Burning. Quote, pigs experience hope, which we know because if raised in decent conditions, they anticipate that pleasurable things will happen to them. End quote. That's Barbara J. King at npr.org. Listen, I once spoke with a man who worked on a pig farm. This labor is not what he wanted, but wanting meant nothing to him, only need. When the farm burned, you could smell the smoked shit and flesh for miles, he said. Like someone mistook the smokehouse for the outhouse. His left hand was lame and bandaged, not from blistering, but a needle meant for a pig's hip. His work had been to dose and sort. Syringe in one fist, ink in the other, stab and stripe, stab and stripe, stab and stripe, until needle broke against a thumb's thick knuckle. I wasn't working that shift, he said, so I didn't hear their screams, but I imagined them. Listen. Can you hear them, son? All those hopeless cries in the orange night. I remember yours at the threshold of your bedroom door. How the disorder had become too much. How a friend's farewell had become too much. How the Adderall had become too much. Stab and stripe, stab and stripe, stab and stripe. Your tear-wet face against my chest. I do not have to imagine your cries. We cleaned, your mother and I, clearing and sorting the wreck and waste, until, after the hours piled upon years, and almost too late, I found your clutter-buried heart, needful and ablaze, where it nearly set fire to us all.
Okay, next up we have Dave Waldrop.
So I won't forget it, I want to tell you that you're sitting on a chestnut stump, and you're sitting on a chestnut stump, and you are too, and you are, and I'm standing on it. At the turn of the last century, and at the time that our ancestors came from Europe, there were 8 billion chestnuts on the east of the Mississippi River. Some of you already know this. Around 1900, a bunch of chestnuts were brought into the botanical gardens in New York City. They had a blight that the American chestnut had no resistance to, Darrell. You know that. So those trees began dying back to the roots at a rate of 50 miles per year. And today you still see sprouts coming from the roots if you get out in the woods and know what you're looking for. How many of you know? Darrell. Darrell, don't you saw another piece of chestnut till you find a chestnut sprout. Here's a chestnut leaf. This is not an American chestnut, but it's a hybrid. This is a stump here, an imaginary stump. It's only 10 feet in diameter. There was a chestnut up on the head of Rough Buck Ball that Ziegler and Grosscup slept under in 1884 that was 11 feet in diameter. The largest ever measured in America was 17 feet in diameter. Wow. That's a pretty good sized tree, folks. The American Chestnut Foundation is working, trying to figure out how to get the resistance gene in some type of American chestnut. And this is a poem that I wrote about that and submitted it to the American Chestnut Foundation, which is based in Asheville, North Carolina. They published it a couple of years ago. Now they're doing a compilation of poems, songs, and stories about the American chestnut in the effort to bring it back. Of course, we will never see a mature chestnut. We'll never see really anything more than an infant. When you stop and figure that all the years it took for a chestnut to grow to 100 feet tall and 10, 12, 15 feet in diameter. But maybe we can do it for our grandkids. And I recently submitted a song, the only song I've ever heard that my son and I wrote, is called Cutting Chestnuts. It takes place in Proctor, North Carolina. Does that word ring a bell for anybody? It's down in Swain County, and the lake, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, took Proctor. There are still some pieces of things there to kind of mark where it was. But that's another project that I'm working on, is to see if the American Chestnut Foundation wants to use that song that my son and I wrote in some promotional activities. This is merely a poem that I wrote, and it's pretty damn good, even if I did write it. Trying to be as modest. Trying to be as modest as I know how. When I leave, I'm going to leave this stump here, and that as a visual reminder is what the chestnut was until about 1940 in this part of the country. This is just called chestnut trees. Chestnut trees have been around just about as long as the sacred ground of the Chippewa and the Cherokee. Let's hope they last eternally. It's a handsome wood for furniture and strong for structures that have endured in the simple beauty of a split rail fence or in walls that shield us from the elements. Their nuts that rained down in the fall had nourishment for one and all. Bear, turkey, deer, and grouse, and bread on the table of every house. Then their cousin was brought from the Orient, and although there was no harm meant, chestnut trees could barely withstand the blight that spread in our eastern land. In a few short years, our magnificent king was forced to survive as a mere sapling. But those saplings are the source of strength, and whatever it takes will go the full length to restore chestnut trees to their rightful place in all the forests that they once graced. Now scientists, foresters, and people of the land are working together, giving chestnuts a hand. Chief Seattle said, all things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the children of the earth. That's all I got to say about it. Thank you. I'll be back and get my stump.
Okay.
We've got to run. I forgot to tell you.
Pretty good.
Thank you very much. Even if I did have something to do with it.
You're leaving your tent. What? Tent? That's still on the ground. Oh, you picked up the tent?
Yeah, y'all can sleep on that tonight if you want to. He won't make a tent out of it. Good to see you.
All right, next up we have Andrew Clark.
So Andrew Clark, live in Candler, so a little bit of a drive over today. I'm a novelist and poet, which sounds impressive, but probably just means I can't decide what I want to be when I grow up.
Can't keep a real job.
Can't keep a real job. I have one of those too. So yeah. So I'm going to read 3 poems for you. All 3. Well, I'm going to read 2 actually. Both of them come from a collection of poems that's going to be published by Main Street Rag Press this fall. So that's how I met Benjamin. So the first poem, kind of what inspired this, my mom, when I was 5 years old, started dating. That's weird, right? When you're 5 years old. So she met this gentleman, brought me to his house, went down a long, scary hall, and his father was in this back bedroom, ill. He had tubes to breathe and so forth. And fast forward, she marries this guy. And then I move into the house, into that bedroom, where I saw the man. So the poem is called A Ghost Named Alvin. A ghost named Alvin played the trumpet, floating over your bed when you were 5 and as skinny as a waif. After your mother took you to a strange man's house and laid you in a strange man's bed. Your mama said, "Don't worry, I'm just down the hall." And you said, "Ain't this someone else's bed, the man with all the tubes?" And she said, "Oh, that's just Papa Alvin. He's gone on to see Jesus." And you said, "But ain't these his green sheets?" They were his sheets. And this was his bed, which smelled like Alvin, who smelled like peanuts. On the first night, Alvin came billowing through your curtains, levitating over your bed, smiling. The next night, Alvin played the fiddle and told you he was bored of the afterlife. One night he came and danced up high, no longer needing the tanks to breathe. He gestured like a lion tamer in some kind of night circus. One night, the man on the news said the world would end at sunset. And this made sense because the Bible clearly says the world will explode. And so you sat and watched the sunset, waiting for the end. When the world fell dark and nothing caught a flame, you climbed back into bed and waited for Alvin's embrace. So this next poem, we kind of have a frantic society. We're overscheduled. We have stuff to do all the time, so it's just trying to resist that. It's called an ode to slow moving. Let the sunlight wake you, all your clocks unplugged. Let time pour out on your plate like molasses, honey, and butter on your plate. Mixing like Ninny dropped biscuits in the morning, mixing like her cornbread in the iron skillet by night. Take time to read the paper, a real paper, unfolded at the kitchen table. Read every page if you like. Take your coffee slow stirring, slow sipping, stirring in the heavy cream if you choose. Take time to read a book and don't rush through it. Let every word skip along the creek like a slick stone in the summertime. Go for long walks. Leave your cell phone behind. Don't count your steps. Just look to the trees and let them speak. Listen to the birds, and instead of just hearing their songs, memorize them. Pull them into your skin. Ignore bad news and smile at the sun, the way it hangs lazily in the sky. Refuse to rush. Let the fibers of your muscles twitch with slow labor, and don't wipe away your sweat. Then rest on your wood rocking chair and watch the cotton grow. But most of all, when you hold her, go slow. Go even slower. Stoke fires that smolder like not flame, then sleep your deepest sleep. Thank you.
Next up is Susan White.
All right, Susan White. And I'm going to read from a novel. This is actually I think it's the first part of the novel. I've been working on this for a while. It's not a very long section, I hope. But there's 3 characters, and their names are Fletcher, Rose, and Boyd. But anyways, it's set on one of these tourist plantations in Virginia, which is where I'm from. And the only other thing that's probably helpful to know is that the Boyd, who is the young man in the story, has just been hired to work on this plantation, and Fletcher is the caretaker of the plantation. And it's called Rose Payne. It may have been because the day had turned very hot, or because something else was in the back of his mind. But when Fletcher returned from the feed store and could not find Boyd, he headed without thinking for the pool. He found Boyd and Rose there, both silent, looking at him when he came into the clearing as if they heard him coming. Rose sat on the edge of a low, reclining chair, hunched forward as if she were studying the ground. She was wearing the same oversized t-shirt she seemed to wear every time she went to the pool. Her hair wasn't wet, so she hadn't been swimming yet. Boyd was standing at the edge of the pool, faced toward it and away from Rose. "I finished the flower beds," Boyd said, looking away from Fletcher and down into the pool. "Great." Rose just looked at Fletcher, expressionless. "I was asking her about the chlorine," Boyd said. "I haven't put any in yet. It seems like you're using too much." "I told him not to use it anymore," Rose said. "It's drying out my hair anyways." "It's okay with me," Fletcher said. "What about your mother?" Rose didn't say anything or even look at him. She was looking at her feet. "I can keep it clean without much chlorine, really," Boyd said. "You don't think she'll notice?" Fletcher looked at Rose. "He says not," Rose said. They were silent. Fletcher knew he ought to check with Mrs. Payne, Rose's mother, because she might even fire Boyd over something that small, since Boyd had worked for her for such a short time. But he also knew better than to say this to the girl. He'd known her and her brother since they were born, and didn't hesitate to tell any of them what they should or shouldn't do. Mrs. Payne had even told him to let her know if her children were up to anything. But as she had on many other occasions, occasions since she turned 14 or so. He knew Rose would fight him, even tell him to go to hell. Right now it seemed silly to take sides, and in truth, somewhere deep down, he'd rather take sides with Rose than with Mrs. Payne. "You're not cleaning it now, are you?" Rose looked at Fletcher and looked away, bringing the back of the chair as far up as it would go and sitting back in it. "I want to go swimming." "No, we already did," Fletcher said. He noticed Rose looking at Boyd as Boyd walked around the edge of the pool looking into the water. Boyd looked up and caught both of them looking at him. Boyd said to Fletcher, "She'll never know the difference except for the smell, I guess. But the spring's really clean. You don't need chlorine." "I tried to tell him that," Rose said, looking still at Boyd and then putting her head back and closing her eyes. "Okay, we'll see," Fletcher said. "We'd better go mow." Boyd came around the pool. "See you," he said to Rose. "Have fun," Rose said. As they walked back along the path, Fletcher wanted to ask Boyd what he thought of the girl, but couldn't think of how to. "Do you think I should talk to Mrs. Payne?" Boyd asked. "No, I wouldn't. She'd just say no. It's not that big of a deal. She doesn't ever go to the pool. I don't know how the hell anyone swims in that pool. It's so cold." After a moment, Boyd said, "How old is she?" "At least 17, maybe 18. Why?" Something in the tone of Fletcher's question must have struck Boyd, because he said too quickly, "I was just wondering. You're right, though. She is a little weird." Fletcher thought of telling him more about what he knew of the girl, but didn't. They walked the rest of the way to the barn in silence, and then talked about the mowing. Later, when Fletcher was on the riding mower and Boyd was using the push mower up close to the house and around the places Fletcher couldn't get to, Rose came with a plastic lawn chair, hat, and sunglasses and lay in the sun. She did at least bother to pick a spot Fletcher had already mowed. Fletcher could never decide if Rose liked him or not, or liked anyone. He often felt she saw him as her mother's yes boy, doing everything she told him to, without question. Thinking this, knowing it was true, almost made him dislike Rose. But in general, he always seemed to come back to feeling sorry for her. Late in the afternoon, as they were getting ready to leave for the day, standing in the parking lot, it was Boyd who said to Fletcher, "All she does is lie around outside. I never see her go anywhere. Her parents took her car away from her. She's gotten in a lot of trouble. They sent her away for a year, but I really don't know the story. She just came back last month. She sure seems older than 17. She's pretty screwed up, I think, but look at her parents. Who wouldn't be?" He hesitated, thought twice about what he'd said. "But I don't know. Maybe she's more okay than they are. She used to be a really sweet little girl. All she ever did was ride those horses. Now they never get ridden." Fletcher thought that perhaps Boyd would ask about Rose's family, about Mrs. Payne, but instead he just nodded. Fletcher wanted to warn him not to get involved with her or any of her family. "Well, I'll see you later." Boyd turned toward his van. "See you tomorrow." Aloud to himself, as he pulled out of the parking lot, Fletcher said, "Makes you wonder what he's thinking." Over the past month or so, he'd learned a little about Boyd, but not much. The boy didn't talk much, or maybe I talked too much. He talked about his girlfriend, May, about his children, and he talked a little about Vietnam. Boyd was a good listener who hardly ever asked outright about anything, but just let Fletcher run his mouth. Or maybe he didn't listen well. Maybe that was why Fletcher didn't worry about talking about almost anything that came to his mind. Does it really matter what two near strangers whose ages and lives are so different say to each other? Sometimes Boyd appeared to listen. He'd ask a few follow-up questions, like if Fletcher had been drafted or wanted to go to Vietnam. But he didn't ask why anyone would want to go when Fletcher said he'd volunteered, or whether Fletcher had killed anyone. He said his father had been in the Air Force, but nothing else. Fletcher talked more about coming home after the war than about the war itself, working construction, on road crews, and even for the railroad up until he'd ended up working for the Paynes for almost 20 years now. In time, with the heat and the lull of the working routine, they began drinking beer together at lunch or later in the afternoon when they'd finished their work. Boyd rarely drank more than one, while Fletcher averaged 4 or 5, talking away in an even more random way, asking around about questions that never amounted to anything. "Do you figure they communicate with each other?" Fletcher said one afternoon as they sat taking their break in the shade by the barn. He was referring to 2 stray kittens that had been born in the barn to a wild mother cat Fletcher had been feeding for a while. The kittens, though very shy, had become a little tamer than their mother over time, and they often stayed close by, waiting for some food. They seemed to. About what, do you think? I don't know. Just being cats, I guess. Whatever all cats communicate about. They're a lot tamer than their mama, huh? Do you figure that makes it different between them? Or she knows they're different from her? Boyd shook his head, definitively, laughing slightly. No, I doubt it. I saw her teaching about them how to hunt for mice. You did? Yeah. But I don't guess there's a lot to it. They seem to learn pretty much by instinct, don't you think? But I've seen her bringing live mice for them to play with and kill, and I think they've started following her around more when she goes out. My little girl loves animals. She has a kitten now. She talks to it all the time, and I swear it's gotten so it makes noises back a lot of times. Seems to me she talks to that cat more than to us. From here, somehow Fletcher ended up talking about a puppy he'd had when he was a boy that a neighbor had shot, and how his father had told him the puppy shouldn't have been over there. He almost asked Boyd about his parents then, but didn't. One Saturday, he invited Boyd to go with him to a fair in Hopewell. It was not a county fair, but one of those that sets up at a mall parking lot with amusement rides and some booths. Fletcher had told his girls he'd take them. Boyd said he'd go, and met them at Sherwood that morning, riding in the van with them. On the drive, his oldest girl, Cindy, talked non-stop to Boyd, though Fletcher tried to get her to stop. But Fletcher said it was okay and responded to her enough to encourage her. So Cindy latched onto him and insisted he go on all the rides with her, which worked out well, as there were some rides Caroline, his youngest, didn't want to go on. There were booths set up for winning toys for local craftspeople to sell what they made. In one of those booths, Fletcher recognized a black man he'd been friendly with since he was a boy. After they'd left the man, whose name was Charles, Fletcher told Boyd, "We used to fish together. You'd never know it, but he has a plastic foot. He was in Vietnam. He sells wooden oars that he carves himself. I saw them. They're amazing. That's a weird place to be selling them, though. He paints some of them, too. He's an artist. He needs to find a better place to sell them," Boyd said. Fletcher didn't know anything about art, but agreed with Boyd. There was a moment of silence. "Are you an artist?" Fletcher asked. "No," Boyd almost laughed. "I'm a gardener." "Mrs. Payne said you had a degree in, what's it called?" "Horticulture. But that's way too fancy a word. I like gardener better." The girls were in the back of the van, and Cindy was sulking because Fletcher had told her she had to be quiet for a while on the way home, or he'd take the stuffed animal he'd won her away. "I'd like to have a skill like that, wouldn't you?" Boyd said. "Something that I'd learned from my family, like making musical instruments. I always thought that would be the best." Then he was quiet. "What are you going to do with your degree?" Fletcher said. "Garden, that's what I do. I'm supposed to start doing some landscaping at Sherwood." For an instant, Fletcher wondered how much Mrs. Payne was paying him. Then he didn't really care. "I bet you can make a better living gardening than Charles does selling those oars. He makes more money selling fish." "Maybe. But I'm talking about something that's like an art, that gets passed down like his father taught him. Or even like you said, you taught your son about fixing cars." "I taught him some, but he learned a lot of it in school, too. Your daddy never taught you anything like that?" "I never really knew my dad. My mom left him. I had a stepdad, and he tried for a while to be like a real father. But then I started getting in trouble, and he didn't listen to him. And he and my mom split up. My mom drinks too much. But I guess I really do mean something a little more different. Those oars must take so much time to do." "Yeah, I know. But I bet you he didn't sell any, just some of those little animals he carves." Boyd didn't say much, and Fletcher couldn't think of how to get back to the subject of his family. He said he thought he probably drank too much himself. Boyd said, "Not compared to my mom, believe me." But again, he was silent, and as they were almost back to the plantation, Fletcher didn't say anything. He wondered if people ever told each other more than half the story. He'd known for a long time that men and women mostly didn't really talk to each other. But did anyone ever work the whole story out in their heads enough to be able to talk about it? Maybe if you knew and trusted someone for years, he thought, if that ever happened.
Next up is Avram.
Avram. Come on, Nick.
We go plumbing today?
Yeah.
Cool.
No, we're not doing plumbing today. I'm sorry. What I'm going to read, this is an essay I wrote just before New Year's of 2018, and there's nothing, I have to warn you, there's nothing politically neutral about this essay.
Oh, darn.
And some people in this room may well disagree with many of the things I'm saying here, and you're certainly welcome to speak your piece at any time, and hopefully neither of us will get arrested. So this is called a guide to those who just don't understand the progressive agenda. Ever since September 17th, 2011, the beginning of the Occupy Wall Street movement in Zuccotti Park, in the financial district of New York City, there has been a futile consistency in the methods used to distract from and attack the basic progressive message about the injustice of income and wealth disparity in America. The Occupy movement's message has resonated so deeply in the psyche of American culture that it has largely frustrated both right-wing Republicans and Democratic centrists who view progressive populism as anathema, and who seemingly can't understand why this anti-establishment movement continues to grow and thrive despite their attempts to derail it. The frustration of the establishment continued and deepened as Bernie Sanders announced his candidacy for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination in May of 2015, broadcasting essentially the same message as the Occupy movement, but with a much larger bullhorn. The first reaction of the established mainstream news media was to ignore the news they didn't like or understand. For instance, National Public Radio, NPR, at first refused to acknowledge or report on the occupation of Zuccotti Park until this omission from the news became an embarrassment. It took the threat of a boycott to finally push NPR to send someone out to interview the occupiers at Zuccotti Park. Likewise, in the summer of 2015, NPR political commentator Mara Liasson, after giving a full analysis of the presidential race that included all 17 Republican candidates, large and small, vying for their party's nomination, proceeded to smoothly announce that on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton had no opposition. She mentioned no other candidates, even as Bernie Sanders was attracting crowds of 30,000 deeply inspired supporters in Seattle, Portland, and Los Angeles. Other major news outlets issued similar reporting at the time. Apparently, the staff and management of NPR, CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, and Fox had never heard of the internet and weren't aware that most people, especially those under 40 years old, now have access to information other than through their monopolies of the airwaves. When Sanders tied Clinton in the Iowa caucuses and then won a 67% landslide in the New Hampshire primary, the corporate news media could no longer pretend he didn't exist. That's when ridicule and attack replaced the vacuum in news coverage of the Sanders campaign. Although this type of coverage has continued to this day, Bernie Sanders consistently remains the most popular politician in the country with the highest favorability ratings of any national figure. Poll after poll taken through the 2015 to 16 campaign season and now through 2018 indicates that he would be the strongest potential candidate against Trump or any other Republican opponent in a national election. Some will point to Joe Biden as the exception to this statement, but Joe Biden has not yet had to stand opposite Bernie Sanders on the debate stage to defend his ties to big banks, the fossil fuel industry, and big pharma. It won't be long before Biden's foot is once again placed firmly in his mouth as he fades into another also-ran chapter of his career. Bernie Sanders, in contrast, has had a consistent, strong, popular message with nothing to hide for the past 40 years. Every other credible potential candidate for president has now assumed Sanders' positions on most major issues, recognizing their and his popularity and the politically political impracticality of trying to defend the corruption that has defined business as usual establishment politics for the past 3 decades at least. Biden, if he chooses to run, will be in an unenviable position in that regard. So why have the establishment and so-called centrist attacks against Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and other progressive candidates been so ineffective in changing the minds of an increasingly receptive American public? Here is a guide for those among us who seemingly have no clue. 1. We don't care about the gender of a candidate. We care that a candidate advocates for equal pay and opportunity for women. We care that a woman's right to domain over her own body will be respected and protected. We care that a candidate understands the need for paid family leave time and affordable child care for working women and men. We care that members of the LGBT community enjoy the same rights and privileges as everyone else. 2, we don't care about the race or religion of a candidate. We care that a candidate recognizes racial discrimination and injustice in our country and in the world. We care that she or he advocates for fair criminal justice reform, fair law enforcement, fair voting and election laws, fair and equal employment and educational opportunities for all people. 3, we don't care about the age of a candidate. We do care that he or she favors a higher educational system that provides equal opportunities for all people and doesn't leave young people in drowning debt for the rest of their lives. We do care that a candidate recognizes climate change as an existential threat to young people and to future generations. 4, we don't care if a candidate for president owns 3 houses. We do care that a candidate advocates for a living minimum wage of at least $15 an hour indexed to inflation for workers in all sectors and recognizes that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, no one should be working a full-time job and still live in poverty. We care about whether or not a candidate is taking money from large corporate donors that will influence his or her political agenda. We care that a candidate intends to represent the interests of his/her constituents and not the interests of big banks, the fossil fuel industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the war industry, big ag, the private prison industry, and other nefarious special interests. 5, we are not impressed by the question, but how will you pay for it, in reference to Medicare for all. The real question is, how can we afford not to have a single-payer universal health care system, since it is the least expensive and most inclusive system possible? There is a reason every other industrialized country in the world has long ago already implemented a single-payer system. How is it that when it comes to fighting unwanted and unneeded trillion-dollar wars, when we give the banking industry trillion-dollar bailouts, when we give millionaires and billionaires trillion-dollar tax cuts, and when so-called conservatives in our government want to build a useless 2,000-mile-long wall along the Mexican border, nobody asks, but how will you pay for it? 6. We don't care what type of car a candidate owns, how big his or her house is, or if a candidate has to use extensive air travel to run an effective campaign. We care about a candidate's position and willingness to act on public policies to address the climate crisis. We care about a candidate's position and willingness to act on transforming our energy system to 100% clean and safe renewables like solar, wind, geothermal, ocean, and tidal energy. We care about a candidate's willingness to act to rapidly phase out the mining, drilling, and burning of fossil fuels to preserve a habitable world for our children and grandchildren. 7. We don't care about the way a candidate dresses or combs his or her hair or walks or what type of accent he or she uses when speaking. We care about what a candidate says and how much substance there is to his or her words. We care that she or he has an understanding of the basic issues, a plan for addressing our biggest problems in a just manner, and the will and drive to fight for the implementation of just reforms and desperately needed far-reaching policies. We care that a candidate is not owned or influenced by big money interests and is only motivated by the public interest. People under 35 years old will soon constitute the largest voting bloc in the nation. About 80% of this younger generation of all races, religions, and backgrounds identify themselves with all the progressive perspectives and on issues outlined above. This voting bloc will only grow larger from year to year from now on. 75% of registered Democrats and 52% of registered Republicans now agree that Medicare for all is the right path to pursue. A dramatic progressive political shift has taken place in the past 2 years since the 2016 election. Have a happy New Year.
Okay, and our final reader is Sherry Durando.
Oh, I'm the final one again. Okay. I've never done this before, so please bear with me. I'm going to stand on this chestnut stump here and it won't fall. I have been told I have a very soft voice. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay. I'm going to read a couple of poems for you. Close this first. Told you I hadn't done this before with a screen. Long before Me Too, the 60s women's liberation movement built on what was begun by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, and many others. Progress made, the struggle continues, the glass ceiling having morphed into a much more insidious form of oppression. Not just what Seamus Haney spoke of in Old Smoothing Iron, which his mother, after spitting in the face of the old-fashioned iron, lunged it across linen as if it represented, quote, the resentment of women. It seems now, however, that an increasingly misogynistic attitude is at the root of more than exclusion. March being Women's History Month, I thought I'd read at least a couple of poems pertinent to it. In the first poem, Oracle Bones, I used the ear's anatomy as a sort of scaffold on which to display an awful truth. That understanding, if it comes at all, arrives through one's own immediate experience of something, more often than through empathy. The poem's title, by the way, refers to a method of divination known as osteomancy, or seeing the future in bones. Oracle Bones. When bra burning was a consonant protest, taunting tender oracles, it was still but a nominal caress on the lobe, not the resonance off hammer and anvil it became when a girl was first chafed by her trainer. Usually that's the way of it. Nothing matters till it matters. When dissonance drums, makes waves, rattles the bones, opens a window of opportunity for comprehension that echoes through an inner labyrinth, then impulse is transformed into sympathetic vibrations. An orientation which here began with the first little quiver in the stirrup. I'd only known my great-grandmother in her old age, but through sepia Edwardian photographs, I discovered her as a young woman. As they say, a beauty with her whole life ahead of her. After having 7 children, she lost her husband when his car stalled on a railroad track. Her youngest was 2 months old. Still, she refused to farm out her children to be raised by others and instead became a telephone operator, barely making ends meet. This was during the Great Depression. Different political factions in the family see her in one of two lights. And this poem is in part what that's about. America's Great Divide, which persists and around many of the same issues. The poem's called The Grain. She's the image of Edwardian grace, budding rose of the aged grandmother she'll be. Reserve her lightweight carapace till life starched it to a stiff lace collar of endurance. Her inscrutable stare, like the marble gaze of a prophetess, though there are shadows that betray despair already upon a face which duress will mar in later days, when life's stylus also etches what tried men's souls on hers, killing youthful hopes that oft beguile us with bankrupt promises round the corners. That truth reflected in plate glass faces, a widow struggling to feed her children, proving that a shattered gilded age is but a house divided along the grain. Like her life's yarn of strength or injustice, its threads can pull now to find the bias. I've got one more short poem I'd like to read about. Have I read Bliss? Anybody remember? Okay. This is about my mother. I think you'll recognize what it's about. Bliss. Born too late to be part of the greatest, too soon an agrarian for the beat. She came of age in an age in between, was part of a generation stillborn at home. It was after the dust of war settled, when greed exploited peace and fear to distract reason, that Snow White and her dwarfs commenced mining the suburbs. Their trove of gadgets and widgets, temptation, even for a bride intent on heaven. A capitulation devoutly wished that grew from need into tenet of faith. The evidence of things seen turned asset, cul-de-sac in the subdivision of myth. For those of you who didn't get the reference about Snow White and the Dwarfs, it was IBM and all those other companies. I'll close, since this is March and brought us St. Patrick's Day as well. And since I was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, thought I'd read the following. It's called St. Pat. Every spring, it snakes through the gentrified matrix, from St. John the Baptist to Bull, a riot of Kelly derbies, pounding Baudron and shillelaghs, tapping out a concrete heritage. It's Gaelic Morse for the crowds, staggered partisan lines along the cobblestone port, ballast dumped long ago by the English. A real garden variety party in the palms and live oaks, their mossy jabots cascading Victorian and row houses, like southern cataracts of gentility, now decked as everything else is. Green eggs and ham breakfasts, grits and beer, fountains and people. Leprechauns and big-bellied belly dancers on bay, harmless shenanigans for generations oblivious to Irish sectarianism, bombs and band parades. Similar in many ways to those that take place here on the Georgia coast, beneath sunsets ruddy is the fruit of a Southern Rue harvest. Thank you.